Hey, welcome back to the show, and a big thank you for tuning in once again.
As always, we've got a glossary waiting for you in the description, so if any word catches you off guard, it's right there.
All right, let's dive in.
Sophie, I want to be upfront about something before we get into this topic. I have a fairly low tolerance for what I think of as the wellness industry's habit of taking ancient practices, stripping out all the context and tradition, slapping a scientific-sounding label on them, and selling them back to stressed-out office workers at $14 a month via a smartphone app.
So you are going in with an open mind then?
Completely open. But I do think that the way mindfulness and meditation have been marketed and packaged in the last 10 years or so has created a lot of noise around a signal that might actually be worth paying attention to, and I genuinely cannot always tell the signal from the noise.
Which I think is actually a really fair starting point, because I am not here to tell you that 10 minutes of breathing exercises will solve all your problems. But I do think the research is genuinely more interesting and more solid than the wellness industry packaging sometimes suggests. And I think the skeptical reaction to the hype sometimes ends up throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
That is a very good way to frame it. The hype is real, the backlash is understandable, and somewhere in between there might be something genuinely useful. So let's try and find it.
Let's start with what mindfulness actually is, because I think there is a lot of confusion about the term itself. People use it to mean very different things.
Including, in my experience, sitting quietly doing nothing and feeling vaguely guilty that I am not being more productive.
Which is almost the exact opposite of what it is supposed to be. Mindfulness, in its clinical and research context, refers to a specific mental skill, the ability to direct your attention deliberately to the present moment, what you are thinking, feeling, and sensing right now, without judging that experience as good or bad, right or wrong. Just observing it.
So it is a form of attention training, essentially. Rather than your mind drifting to tomorrow's meeting or last week's embarrassing conversation, you practice bringing it back to now.
Exactly. And meditation is one of the main techniques used to practice that skill. You sit, you focus on your breath or on your body or on sounds around you. Your mind wanders, which it always will, and you gently bring it back. That returning is the exercise. The wandering is not failure. It is actually part of the process.
Okay, so let's talk about the science, because that is where I have the most questions. I have seen a lot of headlines about meditation studies over the years, and I am honestly not sure how seriously to take them. What does the research actually show?
The short answer is more than skeptics tend to acknowledge, but less than the apps in the wellness industry tend to claim. The most robust findings are around anxiety and stress reduction. Multiple meta-analyses, studies that combine the results of many smaller studies, have found that mindfulness-based interventions consistently produce meaningful reductions in self-reported anxiety and stress compared to control groups.
Self-reported being the key word there. That is always where I start to get a bit cautious, because people who have signed up for a mindfulness program and invested time and money in it may be somewhat motivated to report that it worked.
That is a legitimate methodological concern, and good researchers in this field acknowledge it. But the evidence does not rely solely on self-report. There are studies showing measurable changes in cortisol levels, that is the stress hormone, in people who practice meditation regularly. There's neuroimaging research suggesting that sustained practice is associated with structural changes in areas of the brain linked to attention, emotion regulation, and self-awareness.
The amygdala research, I have seen that cited a lot. The idea that meditation physically shrinks the amygdala, which is the brain's fear and threat response center.
That finding has been reported, but it is also one of the more contested ones. The effect sizes in neuroimaging studies tend to be small, sample sizes are often limited, and replication has been inconsistent. I would not hang too much on the structural brain change argument specifically. The psychological and physiological effects, reduced anxiety, lower cortisol, improved attentional control, have a somewhat stronger evidence base.
What about depression? I keep seeing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy mentioned in that context.
That is actually one of the strongest areas of evidence. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or MBCT, was developed specifically to prevent relapse in people with recurrent depression. It combines elements of cognitive behavioral therapy with mindfulness practice. Multiple well-designed randomized controlled trials have found it to be as effective as antidepressants for preventing depressive relapse in people who have had 3 or more episodes. It is now recommended by the UK's National Health Service as a first-line treatment for that specific population.
That is actually quite impressive. That is a very different claim from "it reduces stress a bit."
Completely. And I think that is important context. When people dismiss mindfulness wholesale because of the wellness industry packaging, they risk dismissing something that for a specific clinical population is a genuinely evidence-based and life-changing intervention.
The Buddhist origins of the mindfulness practice are genuinely relevant here. In its original context, mindfulness was not about performing better at work or managing stress so you could work longer hours. It was embedded in a whole ethical framework concerned with reducing suffering, not just for yourself, but for others. It was part of a path towards wisdom and compassion, not towards a more efficient quarterly report.
And the critics argue that when you extract the technique from that framework, you can end up with something that is actually counterproductive. The classic example is a corporation teaching its employees mindfulness so they can better cope with a stressful and exploitative work environment, using a tool that was designed to reduce suffering to actually help people tolerate more of it.
I think that critique is sharp and worth taking seriously. And there is a related concern about the individualization of what are often structural problems. If someone is anxious and burned out because of systemic workplace issues, teaching them to breathe more mindfully is not addressing the real problem. It is, as we discussed in our episode on mental health at work, painting over damp.
And yet I find myself not wanting to throw the whole thing out because of that concern, because the underlying skill, being able to observe your own mental states without being entirely at their mercy, does seem genuinely valuable, regardless of how it has been packaged and sold. The problem is with the application and the context, not necessarily with the practice itself.
That is a really important distinction. The technique is not the ideology. Just because mindfulness has been co-opted by corporate wellness programs does not mean that learning to pay attention to the present moment is worthless. Those are separable claims.
Which might be the most useful thing someone can take away from this conversation. Be skeptical of the industry. Be informed about the limitations of the evidence, but do not let the packaging put you off exploring the practice itself on its own terms.
Jake, have you actually tried meditating, or is your opinion purely theoretical at this point?
Purely theoretical would be the honest answer about 2 years ago, but I did try one of those apps for about 6 weeks after a particularly stressful period at work, and my honest experience was more useful than I expected, less transformative than the app implied it would be.
Which I think is actually a very accurate summary of what most people find. The 10-day beginner program is not going to change your life, but if you stick with a regular practice over months, not necessarily every day, not for hours at a time, just 10 or 15 minutes consistently, a lot of people do report a meaningful shift in how they relate to their own thoughts and feelings.
The shift I noticed was less about feeling calmer in the moment. I honestly did not find sitting still and focusing on my breath particularly calming, and more about a slight increase in the gap between a stimulus and my reaction to it. Like something stressful would happen, and there was maybe half a second more before I was fully swept up in it, which sounds trivial, but it was actually quite useful.
That gap is exactly what a lot of practitioners describe. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, famously wrote about the space between stimulus and response as the location of human freedom and growth. Mindfulness practices, in a sense, a method for widening that space deliberately.
That is a much more meaningful way to describe it than stress reduction. It is not about becoming calmer or happier in some passive sense. It is about developing a different relationship with your own mental experience, which is a skill that seems useful regardless of whether the neuroimaging evidence for brain changes holds up.
And that is ultimately how I think about it. Not as a cure, not as a spiritual practice necessarily, not as something that will fix structural problems in your life, but as a trainable mental skill that most people could benefit from developing, in the same way that most people could benefit from regular physical exercise. The evidence that it helps is solid enough that the question is not really does it work, but what does it work for, under what conditions, and for whom?
Which is a much more interesting and more useful question than is mindfulness a scam?
Much more useful, even if less fun to argue about.
I want to raise something that I almost never see mentioned in mainstream coverage of mindfulness, which is the evidence on adverse effects. Because I think part of the reason the wellness industry version of this feels dishonest is that it presents meditation as universally beneficial, with essentially no downside, and that does not match what some researchers are finding.
This is actually really important and under-discussed. A researcher called Willoughby Britton at Brown University has done some of the most thorough work in this area. Her findings suggest that a meaningful minority of people who engage in intensive meditation practice, particularly long retreat formats, experience significant adverse effects, things like increased anxiety, depersonalization, intrusive thoughts, even psychotic episodes in rare cases.
Which makes a certain amount of sense if you think about what the practice is actually doing. You are directing sustained, careful attention to the contents of your own mind. For someone whose mind contains a lot of trauma, unprocessed grief, or psychological vulnerability, that can be a destabilizing experience rather than a calming one.
Britton's research also found that the adverse effects were more common than practitioners and teachers often acknowledged, partly because the culture around meditation can discourage people from reporting negative experiences. There is sometimes an implicit message that difficulty in practice means you are doing it wrong or not trying hard enough.
Which is its own kind of problem. An honest account of any practice or intervention has to include who it might not be suitable for and under what conditions. The evidence seems reasonably clear that for most people, gentle mindfulness practice in normal daily life is low risk, but intensive retreat formats or practice without proper guidance for someone with significant mental health history carries real risks that deserve more transparency.
And that is exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened in a $14 app telling you that 10 minutes a day will change your life. Which loops us back to Jake's original frustration, actually. The hype is not just annoying. It can be actively misleading in ways that matter.
Reluctant convert. I stand by my skepticism of the industry while acknowledging there is something real underneath it.
And now we genuinely want to hear from you on this one, because it is a topic where personal experience really matters.
Our question for today: have you ever tried meditation or mindfulness practice? Did it work for you, or did you find it frustrating or pointless? Whatever your experience, tell us in the comments in English. There is no wrong answer here.
And as always, what topics do you want us to cover in future episodes? We read every comment. Every suggestion is genuinely considered, and the best ideas become real episodes. Drop yours below.
If this episode got you thinking, share it with someone who has strong opinions about the wellness industry. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. Genuinely glad you joined us.
The glossary is in the description with all the key vocabulary.
See you next time.
Take care.
Bye.